He hired her for one day. Just one day. To clean the mess, cook a decent meal, and make the cabin look like a man worth marrying actually lived there. She was a stranger, a hired hand, someone he'd pay and forget. But by the time the sun went down and the fire burned low, Gideon Mercer understood something that terrified him. The woman scrubbing his floors had filled every empty corner of his life in a way his future bride never could. And in 3 days, that future bride was arriving. Like, subscribe, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The cabin had a smell. Gideon noticed it had been cleaned with any intention in a very long time. There was a pair of boots near the hearth that he couldn't remember leaving there. There were 2 tin plates stacked on the rough-hewn table around dusk, even at noon. He stood there for a long moment, hands on the doorframe, looking at all of it the way you look at something you've stopped seeing. Then he said out loud to no one, "Hell." He was 43 years old. He had lived in this cabin for 9 of those years, first as a temporary shelter while he built something better, and then as the permanent solution once he accepted that he was never going to build something better because building something better required a sustained motivation he had never quite managed to locate. The cabin had 2 rooms. The main room held the hearth, the table, 2 chairs, a shelf of provisions, and a collection of tools that had accumulated along one wall like geological strata, the oldest and most forgotten pressed against the logs, the recently used things nearest the door. The sleeping room held a rope bed with a straw mattress, a washstand with a cracked basin, and a wooden chest that contained, as far as Gideon could recall, 1 good shirt, a broken watch that had belonged to his father, and approximately $40 in silver that he kept meaning to take to the bank in Harlow. This was the home he had described in his letters as comfortable and well situated on good land near a reliable water source. He had not lied exactly. The land was good. The water source was reliable. The cabin was, from a structural standpoint, sound. But comfortable was doing considerable work in that sentence, and he knew it. He stepped back outside and looked at the mountains. It was a clear morning, the kind that made the Rockies look like they'd been painted by someone with more ambition than accuracy, all that blue and gray and the first dusty yellow of aspens going over. The air had a bite in it. October was close. Evelyn Whitmore would arrive in 3 days. He had the letter in his breast pocket, though he'd read it enough times to have it memorized. I expect to reach Harlow by Saturday at the latest. Mr. Finch at the postal office has agreed to arrange a wagon to the property. I look forward to meeting you in person and begin in a Philadelphia paper, a thing he'd done after his neighbor Dale Eustace had done the same thing, and ended up with a perfectly sensible wife named Marjorie who could break a horse and make a pie in the same afternoon. Gideon had composed his notice carefully, almost nothing about what she actually felt about anything. His letters were honest in their facts and evasive about everything else. Together they had constructed, through the postal service, an agreement that both of them had too much dignity to call what it actually was, a practical arrangement between 2 people who had run out of better options. He was not a romantic man. He did not expect romance. But standing in front of the cabin that smelled like old smoke and unlived years, he understood suddenly and with some force that he could not bring a woman into this. Not this. He needed help. He rode into Harlow that afternoon and asked around, which in Harlow meant stopping at Lena Marsh's dry goods store and stating his situation plainly, because Lena knew everything about everyone within 40 miles and could produce a solution to most problems within approximately 3 minutes of hearing about them. "You need a cook and a cleaning woman," Lena said, not looking up from the bolt of calico she was measuring. "One person who can do both." "For how long?" "1 day, maybe 2. You need more than 2 days to fix what's wrong with that cabin, Gideon. I need 1 good day. The rest I can manage." Lena set down her scissors and looked at him with the specific expression she reserved for men who were wrong about their own capacities. "There's a woman been passing through. Stopped in 2 days ago asking if anyone needed cooking work. She's camped out by the creek east of Miller's Crossing. Name's Sadie Hartwell. She's been doing seasonal work up and down the range." "What do you know about her?" "Enough. She does good work and she doesn't steal and she doesn't cause problems." Lena paused. "She's not easy, though." "What does that mean?" "Means she'll tell you when you're wrong." Gideon considered this. "That's fine. You say that now." He found the camp easily enough. A small fire, a weathered bedroll, a horse picketed nearby, and a woman crouched over a pan with her back to him. She was maybe 35, lean in the way of people who spent most of their life outdoors, with dark hair pulled back under a battered hat and a canvas coat that had been repaired in at least 3 places with mismatched thread. She didn't turn around when she heard the horse. "I'm not buying anything," she said. "I'm not selling anything." She turned then, looking up at him with direct brown eyes that took his measure without apparent hurry. "Then what?" "Lena Marsh told me you're looking for work. I need someone to clean a cabin and cook for 2 days. Pay is fair." She looked at him a moment longer. "What's wrong with the cabin?" "Nothing structural." "That's not what I asked." He looked at the fire. "It's been kept by a man living alone for 9 years. Something moved across her face. Not quite amusement, not quite pity. "How much?" He named a figure. She named a higher one. He agreed without negotiating, which told her something about the state of the cabin, and she said she'd come in the morning. She arrived before he did. He came back from checking the fence line on the north pasture to find her standing in the open doorway of the cabin, not moving, just looking in with her hat pushed back on her head and one hand on the doorframe. He dismounted. "Morning." "Morning." She did not look away from the interior. "Do you have lye?" "Somewhere." "Vinegar?" "I think so." "Broom?" "Yes." She finally turned and looked at him. "Where do you keep your rags?" "I don't—" He stopped. "I use old shirts." "Get them. Get the lye and the vinegar and that bucket there and fill it from the well. Then stay out of my way." It was not the most gracious beginning he'd ever had with another person, but he did what she said. For the first hour, he mostly stayed out of her way, as directed. He could hear her moving through the cabin, the scrape of furniture across the floor, water sloshing, the occasional pointed silence that, he was coming to understand, was her version of commentary. He brought in firewood and stacked it properly and rehung the door to the sleeping room, which had been sitting at an angle for 2 years because the upper hinge had pulled loose from the frame. He fixed it with new screws and a piece of iron plate he found in the tool pile, and when he was done, it swung clean and level, which gave him a small private satisfaction. Around mid-morning, she came to the doorway and said, "There's no curtain on that window." "No." "The glass is cracked." "I know." "You should replace the glass." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Do you have muslin?" He didn't. He went back to Harlow and bought muslin, and while he was there, he also bought a new glass pane on instinct, though he didn't have a glazier's tools and wasn't entirely certain he could install it. He came back and set the glass against the outside wall and stood looking at the window for a while. And Sadie came out, looked at the glass, looked at the window and said, "Do you have a proper putty knife?" "No." "I do." She produced one from her kit with the air of someone who was not surprised by any of this. "Hold the glass steady." They replaced the window together, which was more complicated than either of them expected, involving the removal of the old glazing compound with a chisel, which Gideon was better at, and the careful setting of the new pane, which required Sadie's more precise hands, and a period of approximately 20 minutes in which they were in close proximity, and the conversation was largely technical and involved several profanities from Gideon when the putty cracked. "Hold still," she said. "I am holding still." "Your left hand isn't." "My left hand is—" He stopped. She was right. He made himself still. When the glass was in and the putty smoothed and they stepped back, the afternoon light came through clean and clear and hit the interior of the main room in a way it probably hadn't in years. The room looked immediately different, bigger, less like a place where a person was merely waiting out the seasons. Sadie looked at it without expression. Then she went back inside. That's it. By noon, she had the main room cleared and scrubbed. She'd moved the tool collection to a spot along the outside wall under the overhang, organized, Gideon noticed, by category and size, which he found both impressive and mildly embarrassing. She'd pulled the 2 chairs out into the sun to air and beaten the buffalo hide against the fence post until the dust coming off it was historical in scale. She'd found, somewhere in the back of the provision shelf, a tin of bear grease and used it to treat the table surface, which had been rough and dry and now had a dull, honest shine to it. He brought her coffee around noon, which he made outside over the small fire pit. It was the only thing he felt confident contributing. She sat on the porch step and drank it without ceremony. He sat on the woodpile. "You're getting married," she said, not a question. "Arranged. A woman from Philadelphia." Sadie looked out at the tree line. "She know what she's coming to?" "I told her it was a frontier property." "That's not the same thing as what I asked." He turned the coffee tin in his hands. "Probably not." A pause. Wind moved through the aspens along the creek, and the yellowing leaves made that sound like distant applause. "She coming because she wants to or because she doesn't have other options?" Sadie asked. It was a direct question and a rude one, and it was also, he knew, the exact right question. "I don't know her well enough to say." "What about you?" He didn't answer right away. The honest answer was complicated in a way he hadn't examined closely. The honest answer was that he had reached an age and a state of solitude that had started to feel less like peace and more like a particular kind of slow damage, and that he had written the letter in March less because he wanted a wife, and more because he had stood in the cabin one January morning and understood that he could not account for the last 4 days. They had passed, and he had eaten and slept and done his work, but there was nothing in them that he could point to. No conversation, no warmth from another person, just silence and white mountains and the way sound carries in deep cold. "It seemed like the right time," he said. Sadie looked at him sideways. "That's also not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She stood up and handed him back the tin and went inside to continue working. In the afternoon, they tackled the sleeping room. The straw mattress was beyond saving, which Sadie told him without sentiment. He dragged it outside, and she helped him remake the rope bed with fresh lashing where it had gone slack, which involved both of them working on opposite sides of the frame, pulling the rope taut in the old wooden peg method. It was physical work, and they fell into a rhythm without discussing it, him pulling, her threading, both counting beats without counting aloud. "You know how to do this," he said. "Not quite a question. My father had a place in Kansas before the grasshopper year. She ran the rope through the last peg and knotted it. After that, we moved around." "Your mother?" "Gone earlier." She stood and pressed her hands down on the rope web to test the tension. "You'll need to get new ticking and a fresh straw fill in Harlow. This'll do until then." He noted how she'd redirected the conversation. He didn't push it. He went to Harlow a second time that day and returned with mattress ticking and a sack of clean straw and 2 other things he hadn't planned on buying. A small looking glass and a pine frame, because the cabin had no mirror at all, and he understood suddenly that a woman would need one, and a second oil lamp because at night the cabin ran on one lamp and the firelight, and that was going to have to change. When he got back, Sadie was outside doing something to the exterior log walls with a brush and a bucket. "What is that?" he said. "Lime wash." She didn't stop. "Found a sack in your stores, never used." She looked at the logs briefly. "It'll help with the bugs and the smell. Makes it look better, too." He helped her. It took 2 hours, working around the cabin, her on one side of the door and him on the other, and the afternoon stretched long and golden the way September afternoons do at elevation, the light hitting the mountains at an angle that made everything look more significant than it was. He was aware, sometime in the second hour, that he had not thought about Evelyn Whitmore in quite a while. "You travel a lot," he said. "Enough." "Where are you headed after this?" She considered. "South, probably. There's a ranch outside Santa Fe that hires winter hands." "Long way." "I don't mind long ways." He looked at her, really looked, the way you can when someone's attention is on their work. She had a scar along the left side of her jaw, fine and old, the kind that had been there long enough to become just part of the face. Her hands were not delicate. She worked without wasted motion in the way that people do when they've had to be economical for long periods. He looked away before she could notice. By late afternoon, she had started on supper, which she did the way she did everything, without asking what he had or what he wanted, just moving through the provisions with professional assessment and producing from what he would have sworn was a collection of mostly inadequate materials, something that smelled like it belonged in a different building than the one he'd been eating in. There was a stew with dried venison and root vegetables, heavy and hot, and seasoned with things he couldn't identify from his own shelves. There was cornbread cooked in the cast iron, which she produced from the side bag she'd brought along with her kit. There was nothing elaborate about it. It was frontier food, solid and plain. but it was the best thing he'd eaten in longer than he could honestly say. They ate at the table, which was clean now, the bear grease surface gleaming in the new lamp's light. Through the new window, the uncracked, clean window, he could see the first stars appearing above the ridgeline. He didn't have good table manners particularly. He'd been eating alone long enough that manners had become theoretical. But he made the effort. "This is good," he said. "It's not complicated." "I mean it." She looked up briefly. "I know you do." They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the night was getting serious, the cold coming down off the peaks with purpose. "What was her name?" Sadie said. "The one you wrote to." "Evelyn." "What's she like?" "Sensible, educated. She taught school in Philadelphia." "She know how to cook?" "I didn't ask." Sadie tore off a piece of cornbread. "Might want to know that. I figured—" He stopped, because the thing he'd figured was I'd manage. And sitting here in a warm cabin, smelling of lime wash and venison stew, with the fire throwing light across the scrubbed floor, he understood what he'd actually figured was someone would manage it for me. "She's going to be fine," he said, mostly to himself. Sadie didn't respond to that. "She wants a stable life," he said. "That's what she wrote. That's what this is." "That what you want?" He looked at the table. "I want to stop eating alone." It was a more honest answer than he intended. He heard it in the air after he said it and resisted the impulse to qualify it. Sadie looked at him steadily. "That's a reason to get a dog," she said. And then quietly, she smiled. Not a big smile, not a gracious one, just a small private thing at the corner of her mouth that disappeared almost before it arrived. He laughed. He didn't mean to, but it came out, and he couldn't remember the last time that had happened spontaneously over a meal. She didn't push it. She stood and cleared the plates and washed them in the basin with the clean water, and he dried them and put them away in the right place for the first time in years. After supper, they sat on the porch, which was too cold for it, but neither of them went in. He'd brought his coat, and she'd pulled her canvas jacket close, and they sat on the porch in the dark with the stars doing what stars do at altitude, filling the whole sky edge to edge with a completeness that was almost aggressive. "What was the grasshopper year like?" he said. A long pause. He didn't press it, and she answered, "It came in July. We heard it before we saw it. This sounded like rain, except it wasn't rain. And when we looked up, the sky was just—" She stopped. Dark. Moving dark. They hit the fields in about 20 minutes. Everything my father had planted, all the wheat, the kitchen garden, the corn that was almost ready. 20 minutes. She was quiet a moment. He tried to fight it. You see grown men running into their own fields with brooms and coats, hitting at the air. It doesn't help. You can't hit your way out of a plague. Gideon looked at the dark shapes of the mountains. "We left that winter," she said. "Sold what we could. My father wasn't the same after that. Men who lose a thing they built, it does something to them. Not all of them can come back from it." "Could he?" She thought about it. "He tried. But trying and succeeding aren't always the same." "No," Gideon said. "They're not." A coyote called somewhere up the ridge. One long note and then silence. "Did you build this place yourself?" she asked. "Most of it. Had help with the main beams." 9 years? 9 years. "And you've been alone the whole time?" "Yes." She was quiet. He could see her breath in the cold air, small white drifts there and gone. "That's a long time to be alone," she said, and there was nothing in her voice except the plain acknowledgement of a fact. No pity in it, no judgment, just the thing stated the way it was. "Yes," he said again. The fire inside had burned low. Through the clean new window, the last of the coals gave a faint orange pulse. "I'll be back in the morning," she said. "Finish up the sleeping room properly. Make sure the larder's organized." She stood and pulled her hat down. "There's more to do than one day." "I know. Thank you." She looked at him once, directly, the way she seemed to look at most things, without apology or elaboration. Then she walked to her horse, which she'd picketed at the post near the fence, and rode out into the dark without a lamp, which told him she knew exactly where she was going. He sat on the porch for a while longer in the cold. The cabin behind him was warm and clean and smelled of lime wash and venison and wood smoke. And when he finally turned to go inside, He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room. The swept floor, the proper fire, the clean window with the lamplight and the stars beyond it, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He stood there naming it to himself and couldn't. He went to bed. The rope bed held taut and even, and he lay on his back in the dark listening to the wind come down the mountain, and thought about the things Sadie had said and the things she hadn't said, and the way the smile had appeared and disappeared at the corner of her mouth, and the plainness of that's a long time to be alone. He thought about Evelyn Whitmore's letter in his breast pocket. I am, as always, practical in my expectations. He stared at the ceiling beams and did not sleep for a long time, and when he finally did, he dreamed of the Kansas plains going dark under a moving sky, and a man running into his own field with his arms raised against something too large and too many to fight. She came back before dawn. Gideon heard the horse first, the soft knock of hooves on the frozen ground, then the familiar sound of her picketing it at the post without being asked to. He was already awake, had been awake since the sky started going from black to that particular dark blue that precedes everything, lying on the rope bed listening to the mountain and thinking thoughts he hadn't given himself permission to examine clearly. He got up and built the fire and put the coffee on, and by the time she knocked twice on the open door and walked in without waiting for an answer, there was something hot to hand her. She took the tin cup without ceremony and stood near the fire, still in her canvas coat, hat pushed back, looking at the main room in the early light the way a carpenter looks at a wall, measuring what was done and what remained. Sleeping room still needs work, she said. I know. And the larder. I know that too. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The fire popped once, loud in the quiet morning. You sleep? She asked. Some. She looked at him briefly, that direct, undecorated look she had, and didn't pursue it. She set down the cup and took off her coat and got to work. The second day had a different quality from the first. The first day had been about the disorder, the accumulation of 9 years' worth of a man not paying sufficient attention to his own life. That work was urgent and visible, and gave both of them something to move toward. The second day was more particular. It required decisions. She went through the larder with him, pulling items from the shelf and holding them up for inspection. There were things in there he couldn't account for. A tin with no label that turned out to contain what might have been peaches at some earlier point in its existence. A sack of cornmeal with a mouse hole along the bottom seam. A jar of something preserved whose provenance was genuinely unclear. How long has this been here? She said, holding up the jar. He looked at it. The contents were dark and slightly separated. I'm not certain. That's the wrong answer. She said it with the discard pile, which was growing. I eat most of what I buy before it gets to that state. Most, she repeated. I'm a single person. Things get away from you. She looked at the shelf. Things don't get away from you. You let go of them and walk off. She wasn't saying it cruelly. She was saying it the way she said most things, as a plain observation about the way the world worked. He didn't argue, because she was right. They reorganized the larder together, him fetching, her deciding, both of them occasionally disagreeing about where something ought to go and working it out without much drama. She had a system that was based on some logic he slowly decoded. Things used daily at eye level, things used weekly on the shelf below, things kept as provisions in case of a bad winter pushed to the back and noted. She made him write a list on a scrap of paper of what needed to be replenished before Evelyn arrived. Sugar, she said. He wrote it. Proper salt, not that. She gestured at the coarse block salt he'd been using. Table salt. A woman from Philadelphia is not going to want to chip at a salt block. I didn't think of that. No, she agreed, without making it worse than it was. Dried fruit if you can get it. Oats. You don't have enough lamp oil. Get 2 bottles. She paused, looking at the shelf. Get flour. Real flour, not this. The bag she held up had gone slightly damp at some point and then dried, and the flour inside had taken on a faint gray cast. He added it to the discard pile himself, which made her glance at him with something that might have been approval. By mid-morning, she had moved to the sleeping room while he was outside splitting wood, which they both understood the supply of would need to be significantly increased before winter. He could hear her moving through the space with the calm efficiency that he was coming to recognize as her particular mode of existence. No wasted effort, no unnecessary noise, just the steady sound of someone who understood exactly what needed doing and was doing it. He split wood for an hour and stacked it under the overhang in the proper way, which meant the older wood in front and the new wood behind, which he knew was correct and hadn't done in years because there was no reason to be organized when you were the only one using it. Doing it right now felt strange, like putting on a good shirt. It fit, but it reminded him of things. He was on his way back in with an armload when he heard a sound from the sleeping room that stopped him in the doorway. Not a crash, not anything alarming, just a short silence after movement, the kind that means a person has stopped what they were doing and is standing still. He set down the wood and knocked on the open door of the sleeping room. "What is it?" "Nothing." Her voice was normal. He went in anyway. She was standing by the wooden chest at the foot of the bed, which was open. She hadn't been going through it. The chest was open at only a few inches, not enough to see in properly, and her hand was on the lid and her face had an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not quite what he'd call sad. Something more compressed than sadness. The look of someone touching the edge of a memory they'd packed away deliberately. "The chest is fine where it is," he said. "I was going to move it." She closed the lid fully. "For the room. It blocks the light from that corner. Leave it where it is." She left it. She went back to what she'd been doing, which was stretching a length of cloth she'd somehow produced as a makeshift curtain for the sleeping room window, pinned at the top rail with wire bent into hooks. It was simple, and it wasn't beautiful, but when she stepped back from it, the morning light came through in a diffuse, softened way that changed the whole character of the room. He looked at it. He looked at the rope bed with its new lashing, the clean wash stand, the basin he'd replaced the cracked one with on yesterday's second trip to Harlow. "It looks like a room someone lives in," he said. "That's the point. I live in it. You sleep in it. There's a difference." She adjusted one of the wire hooks. "A room you live in has something of you in it besides your stuff. You understand what I mean?" He thought about it. Not entirely. She turned and looked at the room with him. "Your stuff is here, your boots and your coat and your chest and the broken watch on the washstand. But there's nothing that says you chose any of it. Nothing that says, this is what I want my life to look like." She paused. "You know what I mean now?" He did. He wished he could say he didn't. "I built this place," he said, and it came out sounding more defensive than he intended. "I know you did. 9 years. I know that too." She looked at him steadily. Building a place and living in it on purpose aren't always the same thing. He stood with that for a moment. Then he picked up the armload of wood he'd brought in and started stacking it in the box by the hearth, and the subject closed itself without being closed. What? Around noon he rode to Harlow for the third time in 2 days, which was 3 times more than his usual weekly average, and Lena Marsh watched him come through the door with a look of pointed interest that he chose not to address. He bought everything on the list Sadie had made, and then stood at the counter with the salt and the lamp oil and the dried apricots thinking about what she'd said, nothing that says this is what I want my life to look like, and made a decision that he didn't examine too closely because he understood he might talk himself out of it if he gave it too much thought. He bought a tablecloth. It was the plainest one Lena had, cream-colored cotton with a narrow stripe, nothing elaborate. The kind of thing that said someone sits at this table and meant to. He stood holding it for a moment, feeling slightly foolish. "That's new," Lena said. "It's for the table." "I know what a tablecloth is, Gideon." "Then why'd you say that?" Lena smiled at him with a warmth that contained a question she was smart enough not to ask out loud. She folded it for him and wrapped it in brown paper, and he put it with the rest of the supplies. On the way back, he stopped at the edge of the property and looked at the cabin from a distance for the first time in years. Probably the first time he'd looked at it the way a stranger would, with fresh eyes instead of the permanent familiarity that makes you stop seeing what's actually there. The lime wash had dried white and clean against the log walls, and with the new glass in the window throwing back the afternoon sun, the place looked not grand, not anything that would make a person stop in the road, but it looked inhabited. It looked like someone had come back to it and decided it was worth caring about. He sat his horse and looked at it for a moment longer. Then he rode in. Sadie had used the time he'd been gone to do something with the porch that he hadn't asked for. She'd pulled out the two old chairs and scrubbed them down and replaced one of the front porch boards that had been soft and slightly rotten for 2 years, and which he'd simply learned to step over. She had a short pry bar in her kit and had pulled the board up clean and replaced it with one from the scrap stack behind the cabin, cut to length, fitted, nailed down. He stood on the porch and tested it with his boot. It held solid. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You were going to walk a woman in a traveling dress around that board every day until it gave way under her." He hadn't thought about traveling dresses. He realized there were entire categories of considerations he hadn't thought about. "Fair," he said. He brought the supplies in and she went through them without comment until she got to the tablecloth, which she unfolded and held up and looked at. "Whose idea was this?" she said. "Mine." She looked at him again with that considering quality. Then she spread it on the table, smoothed it once with both hands, and stepped back. The table with the bare grease shine under the cloth, the clean lamp, the morning's light now come around to the west window. It looked for the first time like somewhere people might sit on purpose to share a meal. "Good," she said. It was a small word, and she said it lightly, moving on immediately to putting away the provisions. But he found himself standing there just a beat too long, looking at the table, at the room, at the difference one day and part of another had made, and he was aware of something building in his chest that he didn't have accurate language for. He went outside and did something pointless with the fence line for 20 minutes until it passed. They had an argument in the afternoon. It was about the sleeping room curtain, except it wasn't about the curtain. She wanted to move the wooden chest to the corner opposite the window to let in the light, and he said to leave it, and she said moving it would improve the room significantly, and he said he'd heard her the first time and to leave it where it was. "There's no reason to keep it in that spot," she said. "I said leave it." Something in his voice made her stop. She stood looking at him with her hands at her sides, and her expression changed, not softening exactly, but shifting, reading something. "What's in the chest?" she said. "That's not your concern." "I'm not asking to open it." "Then stop asking about it." A silence. He knew he was being unreasonable. He knew she knew it too. The chest contained one good shirt, a broken watch, $40 in silver, and a folded piece of newsprint, yellowed now, with the obituary of a woman named Clara Mercer, née Dowd, aged 31, who had died of a fever in the spring of 1871, 2 years before he'd built this cabin, at a time when his life had still contained the theoretical possibility of becoming something other than what it had become. He had never moved the chest because he had never been able to decide whether he was the kind of man who kept or the kind who let go. And the fact that he still hadn't decided was a thing he was not prepared to discuss with a woman he'd known for 36 hours. "I'll leave it," Sadie said simply. She went back to the curtain. He went outside. He stood at the edge of the porch looking at the tree line for a while, one hand on the porch rail she'd fixed. The wood was solid under his palm. When he came back in, she was in the main room starting on supper, and neither of them mentioned the chest again. Bunk. They ate later than the night before, the supper taking longer because she'd decided to do something complicated with the dried apricots and a quantity of cornmeal that had produced, by the time they sat down, a thing he had no name for, but which was sweet and savory, in alternating bites and completely unlike anything he had ever made for himself. "What is this?" he said. "Something my mother made. She was from Tennessee originally. Everything she cooked had dried fruit in it somehow." "She cooked like you?" "Better." She said it without false modesty, as a plain fact. She could feed 10 men from what looked like nothing. She could look at a nearly empty larder and see a meal nobody else could see. "She teach you?" "She tried. I was not a cooperative student at 12. He looked at her. "When did you start cooperating?" The corner of her mouth moved. 14. After she was gone, I had to. Otherwise, my father and my brother would have eaten badly for the rest of their lives. "What happened to your brother?" "California," she said, in the tone that meant California could cover almost anything. "He's fine. I get a letter every few years." "You ever want to stay somewhere?" The question landed in the silence between them and sat there. She turned it over before answering. "I used to want a lot of things," she said. "I got practical." That's what Evelyn wrote to me, that she was practical in her expectations. It's a useful thing to be. Is it? She looked at him directly. It keeps you from being disappointed. It also keeps you from expecting much. Another silence, this one with more weight in it. Outside, the night wind had picked up, moving through the aspens along the creek with that peculiar sound. The sound he'd described to himself once as applause for something that already happened. He hadn't thought that phrase in years and wasn't certain where it had come from. "Do you think she'll be happy here?" he said. Sadie was quiet for a moment. "Do you?" He looked at the tablecloth, at the lamplight moving on the cotton. "I think she'll manage." Managing and being happy aren't the same thing either. I know that. Then why'd you use that word? He didn't answer, and she didn't push it. She got up and cleared the plates the way she had the night before, and he dried them and put them in the right place again. And they moved around the small kitchen space with the easy, wordless coordination of people who had somehow, in less than 2 days, figured out where the other one was going to be. He noticed it, the lack of collision, the way they reached past each other without having to say "excuse me" or "careful." The way the space felt like it had been sized for the two of them, which was irrational because the space was what the space was, and he'd been living in it alone for 9 years. He noticed it and looked away. The night was colder than the last. She didn't go immediately after supper this time. He built the fire up and she sat at the table with her hands around a cup, and the wind pressed against the new window glass, and the room held its warmth the way the room hadn't held warmth in years, because there were 2 people in it. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask. What happened before the cabin?" He looked at the fire. "What makes you ask?" "The chest." He considered refusing again. But the wind was coming off the mountain hard tonight, and the fire was going, and she was sitting across from him with those direct brown eyes that didn't ask for anything except the truth. "Her name was Clara," he said. "We were going to come west together. She died before we got the chance." Sadie didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "How long ago?" 12 years. "And you came anyway. Seemed like the thing to do. I'd already decided this was where I was going. It seemed wrong to just stop deciding. So you built a cabin, and you put the rest in a box, and you kept working." "Something like that." She looked at her cup. "I understand that." "Do you?" "I do." She said it quietly. "The working helps. As long as you're working, there's a direction to things. It's the stopping that gets you." He looked at her. "What do you put in your box?" A pause. "Kansas," she said. "The grasshopper year. A man in Wyoming I spent 8 months trying to believe was good before I accepted he wasn't." She looked at the fire. "A girl I was friendly with in Cheyenne who got sick in the bad winter of '78 and was gone before spring." "That's a lot to carry." "Everybody's carrying something." She said it without self-pity, the way she said most things. "Some people just carry it louder than others." He thought about Evelyn Whitmore's letter. "I am, as always, practical in my expectations." He thought about what it meant to be practical about your own expectations. The discipline of it, the loneliness of it, when you looked at it straight. "She's going to walk into a clean cabin," he said. "That's more than I expected to give her." "It is." "She'll be a good wife, I think. She seems like—" He stopped, because he was about to say she seems like a sensible woman, and he understood that sensible was doing the same work as practical, and both of those words were what you said about a person when you had given up on more than you intended to. Sadie watched him think his way to the end of the sentence and not like what he found there. She didn't fill the silence. "It's the right thing," he said finally. "Probably," she said. Not yes. Not of course. Just probably, offered without comfort, the way you offer the truth to someone who's asked for it. He sat with that for a while. The fire burned. The wind moved the aspens. The cabin held its warmth around them both, and they sat in it the way 2 people sit when they have run out of things to say, but have not yet run out of reasons to stay in the same room. Eventually she stood and said she'd be back in the morning to finish up, and she took her coat and her hat and went out to her horse, and he listened to the hoofbeats go quiet into the dark again. He sat at the table for a long time after she left. He sat at the table in the clean cabin with the tablecloth and the 2 good lamps, and the lime-washed walls and the window that didn't crack the light anymore, and he looked at the chair across from him where she'd been sitting and the cup she'd set down. He left it there. He didn't move it to the shelf the way he'd moved everything else. He went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the mountain, and the thought he kept having, the one he kept turning away from and returning to, was not about Evelyn Whitmore at all. Sadie finished on the third morning. She came at the same hour as the days before the light had fully committed to the sky, and she worked through the last of it with the focused efficiency that Gideon had come to understand was simply how she moved through the world. No wasted sentiment, no lingering on a thing once it was done. She organized the sleeping room the way she'd intended, with the chest left where Gideon wanted it, and the curtain sitting straight on its wire hooks, and the washstand basin filled with clean water. She went through the main room once more, tightening what had loosened, straightening what had shifted, and by mid-morning she stood in the doorway and looked at the whole of it the way a person looks at a thing they are about to leave. Gideon stood behind her, slightly to the left. The cabin was not transformed into something it wasn't. It was still a rough-hewn mountain shelter built by one man's hands over the course of a difficult winter. The logs were imperfect. The floor was packed dirt with boards over it. The two rooms were small, in the way that frontier rooms are small, measured by what a person actually needed and nothing beyond that. But everything in it was clean and intentional now. Everything was where it ought to be and said, however quietly, that someone lived here on purpose. "That's as good as it gets," she said. "It's better than I expected." She turned away from the doorway. She was already wearing her canvas coat. Something in that, the coat already on, the hat already settled, landed in his chest in a way he hadn't anticipated, even though he'd known since the second morning that today was the last. He'd known it and thought he'd accounted for it, the way you account for weather by looking at the sky and deciding you're prepared. And then the weather arrives and you understand you weren't. "I'll get your pay," he said. He counted it out at the table. The amount she'd named, plus a little more because the porch board and the window glass and the lime wash had not been part of the original agreement, and she'd done them without asking. She looked at the extra coins for a moment before she took them. "You didn't have to add on," she said. "I know." She pocketed it without ceremony. "The apricot cornmeal thing. I'll write down what goes in it, for when you need it." "You don't have to do that." "I know." She produced a short pencil from her kit and a scrap of paper and wrote it out at the table, her handwriting clear and economical, the same way she did everything. She slid the paper across to him. He looked at it without picking it up. "Sadie," he said. She looked up. He had something to say. He was aware of something that needed saying and equally aware that he didn't have the right words for it, and that trying for the right words and finding the wrong ones would be worse than silence. So he said the smaller version of the true thing. "I'm glad Lena Marsh sent me to that creek." She held his gaze for a moment. Her expression did the thing it sometimes did, moved toward something and then settled back into its usual directness. "You'll be all right," she said. "The cabin's good. The land's good. A beat. She might surprise you." She picked up her kit and walked out. He followed as far as the porch. He watched her untie the horse and check the girth and swing up with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times in 1,000 different places. She didn't look back at the cabin. "Where will you go first?" he said. "Before Santa Fe. There's a ranch outside Pueblo looking for a winter cook. I'll stop there." "That's a long ride in October." "I don't mind long rides." She said it the same way she'd said it the first time, not as a performance of toughness, but as a plain fact about herself. Then she looked at him from the saddle with that direct, unhurried quality. "Take care of the new window. Keep the putty dry first winter, or it'll crack again." "I will." She touched the brim of her hat once and turned the horse south and rode out through the gate without looking back, and he stood on the porch she'd repaired and watched her until the aspens along the creek took her out of sight. He stood there for a while after she was gone. Then he went inside and looked at the empty cup she'd used the night before, still sitting where he'd left it, and he put it on the shelf with the others. He stood at the window, the clean window, the new glass catching the morning, and looked at the trail south until the aspens stopped moving and the dust settled and there was nothing left to look at. Evelyn Whitmore would arrive tomorrow. She arrived in the early afternoon. The wagon from town came up the track with Tom Finch on the box and a single trunk roped on behind and a woman sitting very straight on the seat beside him. Gideon saw them from the fence line where he'd been doing unnecessary work since morning, and he left the fence and walked toward the cabin to meet them. Evelyn Whitmore was not what he had imagined from her letters, which was predictable. Nobody was. She was perhaps 38, composed in the way of someone who had practiced composure until it became structural, with dark hair pinned neatly under a traveling hat that had seen better days and good wool coat that was clearly Eastern and not suited to what October in the mountains was going to ask of it. She had gray eyes and a direct way of looking at things that he recognized, obscurely, from somewhere. Tom Finch helped her down from the wagon with a ceremony she accepted gracefully and didn't need. She looked at the cabin. He watched her look at it, really watched, trying to read the look. She took in the lime-washed walls, the straight porch, the clean window with afternoon light coming through it. He couldn't tell what she made of it. "Mr. Mercer," she said, turning to him. "Miss Whitmore." He reached for her trunk and then stopped, remembering something. "Should I—" "Yes, please." She nodded at the trunk. "Thank you." He carried it inside. She followed, and he heard her stop just inside the doorway, the way Sadie had stopped 2 days earlier, looking at the room. "It's very clean," she said. "I had help. I can tell." Not an accusation. An observation. She came fully inside and walked slowly around the main room, looking at the shelves, the hearth, the table with the cream-colored tablecloth. She touched the edge of the tablecloth with 2 fingers. "This is new." "Yes." She looked at him. "You bought it for me." "I bought it for the table." Something moved in her expression, a small, knowing thing, and she said nothing further about the tablecloth. She looked at the window, the good light coming through it. "The view is beautiful," she said. "You described that accurately." "The mountains don't require much describing." "No," she agreed. "I suppose they do the work themselves." Tom Finch took his pay and his leave, and they were alone in the cabin, and the silence that settled after the wagon noise faded was the particular silence of 2 strangers who have made an agreement and are now standing in it. Gideon built the fire up because the afternoon was going cold. Evelyn took off her traveling coat and folded it over the back of one of the chairs and stood at the window looking out at the ridge with her arms crossed over her chest, not defensively, but in the way of someone thinking. "I'll make coffee," he said. "Please." He made it. She sat at the table. He sat across from her. They drank it, and neither of them filled the silence with false pleasantries, which he found he respected about her even in that first hour. She was not a woman who performed comfort she didn't feel. "The letters were honest," she said at last. "I tried." "You left some things out." He looked at his cup. "What did I leave out?" "The altitude, the cold." She glanced at the window. "How far it is from everything." "I mentioned that." Mentioning and understanding are different. She said it without blame, just the fact of it. "I'll adjust." "I adjusted to Philadelphia, and that was its own particular wilderness." A pause. "What did I leave out?" He considered it honestly. "What you actually wanted," he said. Her chin came up slightly. It was the first unguarded expression he'd seen from her. "I wanted stability," she said. "I wanted to stop being—" She stopped. Then, "In Philadelphia, I was a school teacher who had passed the age when people stop expecting you to become anything else. That has its own kind of difficulty." "I understand that." "Do you?" "I spent 9 years being a rancher who had passed the age when people stop asking questions about it." She looked at him steadily. Then she said, "We're practical people, Mr. Mercer." "Gideon." "Gideon." She tested the name once. "We're practical people. We can make something workable from practical materials." "I believe that," he said. And he did believe it. Sitting across from her at the table in the clean cabin, with the fire going and the mountains doing their usual magnificent indifference outside the window, he believed it entirely. She was intelligent and composed and honest in a restrained way, and he could see a life with her, sensible, ordered, respectful. He could see it clearly. He just couldn't feel it. He noticed that. He noticed the clarity of the vision and the absence of anything warmer, and he set the noticing aside. The way you set something aside when you know looking at it directly won't help. The first 3 days were navigable. Evelyn was a capable woman, more capable in practical terms than her Philadelphia background suggested. She learned the stove quickly, and she was not precious about the cold or the distance or the particular frontier quality of everything. The roughness of it, the way comfort required constant effort. She made herself useful without being asked, and she didn't complain, which he appreciated. They were polite to each other, consistently, carefully polite, The way you are with someone when you're both working hard at something. She slept in the sleeping room. He slept in the main room, on a bedroll near the fire, because they were not yet married and because the arrangement was unspoken but mutually understood. They had agreed, in one of the practical discussions that were becoming the texture of their relationship, that they would go to the courthouse in Harlow at the end of the month. The end of the month was 3 weeks away. On the 4th day, she found the recipe. He was outside when it happened. He came in to find her standing at the shelf with the scrap of paper in her hand, reading it. She had been reorganizing the provisions. She'd asked, the day before, whether she could arrange the larder to her preference, and he'd said yes. And she'd found the paper where he'd left it, tucked under the cornmeal bag. She held it up when he came in. "What is this?" "A recipe. Someone wrote it out for me." "The woman who helped clean," she said. Not a question. "Yes?" Evelyn looked at the paper for another moment. Her expression was the careful, neutral one she used when she was reading something more than the surface of a thing. Then she set it back on the shelf, neatly, in the exact spot it had been. "It's a good recipe?" she asked. "Very good." "I'll try it sometime," she said, and went back to the larder. He watched her back for a moment. He had the uncomfortable sense that Evelyn Whitmore saw considerably more than she spoke about, and that the gap between those two things was going to matter at some point. It mattered sooner than he expected. On the 6th day, she asked him to tell her about the woman. They were sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, the sun going down behind the peaks and the temperature dropping fast the way it did at elevation, both of them wrapped in coats and watching the light leave the mountains in stages. It was the closest thing to peaceful they had been since her arrival, and he was glad of it. And then she said, "Tell me about the woman who cleaned the cabin." He looked at the mountains. "Her name is Sadie Hartwell," he said. "She does seasonal work up and down the range. She was camped near Miller's Crossing when I hired her." "How long was she here?" 3 days. "What's she like?" He thought about how to answer that honestly without answering the part that would be true and damaging in equal measure. "Capable," he said. "Direct. She knows how to live out here." "Yes," Evelyn said. "I can see that." "What do you mean?" She turned to look at him with those gray eyes that were, he was learning, far more perceptive than their composure suggested. "I mean that the way this cabin is arranged is not the way a man arranges things for himself. It's the way a woman who understands this life arranges things." She paused. "The curtain in the sleeping room, the position of the lamp oil, the way the larder is organized." Another pause. "The tablecloth." He said nothing. "I'm not accusing you of anything," she said. "I'm observing." "She was hired to prepare the cabin before you arrived. That's all it was." Evelyn looked at him for a moment longer. "Is that all it was?" she said, and it was not quite a question, which made it considerably worse than if it had been. He didn't answer. The light was almost gone from the highest peaks now, that last gold to pink to gray sequence happening above them in silence. A cold wind came off the ridge with teeth in it. "You don't have to explain anything to me," Evelyn said, and her voice was careful in the specific way of someone choosing each word for its weight. "We made a practical arrangement. I came here with open eyes." "You came here in good faith," he said, "and I—" He stopped. "And you hired someone to make this place livable before I arrived," she said. "Which you did because you were trying to do right by me. I understand that." She pulled her coat closer. "I'm asking something different." "I know what you're asking." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that contains the shape of a truth neither person has said. "I need to know," Evelyn said finally, "whether the life you imagined, when you imagined it, whether I was in it." It was the most direct thing she had said to him and the most devastating. He heard the question clearly, and he sat with the full weight of it, which was the weight of 6 months of letters and a practical arrangement and a tablecloth bought in Harlow, and 3 days with a woman who understood his life without explanation, and he could not find, when he searched himself honestly, for the answer Evelyn deserved, the answer she was hoping for. He looked at the dark mountains. "I imagined someone," he said. "I wanted someone." "That's not the same thing as imagining me." "No," he said. "It's not." Another long silence. Somewhere up the ridge, a bird called once and went quiet. "I appreciate the honesty," she said. The steadiness in her voice cost her something, and he knew it, even if it took a few days to arrive. "Evelyn, don't." She said it gently. "Don't qualify it now. That would be worse." He was quiet. She sat beside him, looking at the last light leaving the sky above the peaks, her profile composed and private, and carrying something that he felt genuinely sorry to have put there, because Evelyn Whitmore was a good woman who had come a very long way to try to build something real, and she deserved better than a man who was 3 days behind the truth of his own heart. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I don't know yet." She stood. "I'm going to go inside." He let her go. He stayed on the porch alone in the full cold of the evening, his hands on the rail she hadn't fixed. That was the one section Sadie hadn't gotten to, the right side of the rail that was slightly loose, and he'd meant to fix it himself and hadn't, and that small undone thing felt like a metaphor he didn't want to examine. He thought about what he'd said and what Evelyn had heard in the spaces between. He thought about what she'd asked, whether I was in it, and the honesty of her willingness to ask it, and how much easier it would have been for both of them if she had not been that kind of woman. He thought about Sadie, which he had been trying not to do. The thought arrived the way it had been arriving for days, direct and unwelcome. Not welcome because he knew what it meant, and knowing what it meant required him to look at all the rest of it and account for himself honestly. An honest accounting of that kind is not a comfortable process for anyone. He thought about the way she'd sat at the table across from him with her hands around a cup and the fire throwing light across her face, and the way the cabin had felt with her in it, and the way he'd stood at the window after she rode south and watched the aspens until they stopped moving. He thought about, "That's a long time to be alone." He thought about how she'd said it, not with pity, not with the performance of understanding, but with the plain recognition of someone who knew the same territory from the inside. He stood on the cold porch for a long time. Inside, through the new glass window, he could see the lamp Sadie had shown him where to place because the light from that position reached the table and both chairs evenly. He could see Evelyn moving through the room quietly, tidying things that didn't need tidying because that is what people do when they are trying to hold themselves together through motion. He watched her through the window he'd installed with Sadie's guidance. In the cabin Sadie had brought back to life, at the table where Sadie's tablecloth lay under the lamplight Sadie had positioned, and the thing he felt, not toward Evelyn, but toward the absence of someone else, settled into him with the permanence of something that was not going away. He knew it then. He had known it before, probably. But standing on the porch in the dark with the mountains gone to black, and the cold serious, and the lamp burning inside across the tablecloth, he stopped pretending he didn't know it, and looked at it plain. He had hired her for one day. And she had walked out of it 3 days later and taken something with her that he couldn't name, but could absolutely feel the shape of. The way you feel the shape of a thing by the space it leaves. He stood there a long time. Then he went inside and told Evelyn he was sorry, and meant it, and she looked at him with those clear gray eyes and said, "I know you are." And they sat at the table on opposite sides of the tablecloth and drank their coffee in the kind of silence that holds, between two honest people, everything that still needed to be said. The conversation that ended the engagement happened 2 mornings later, and it was not the conversation Gideon had been bracing for. He had been expecting something harder. He had been expecting, in the way of a man who understood he had behaved badly, even without intending to, a reckoning that involved raised voices or tears or the particular cold fury of a woman who has been wronged and knows it precisely. He had been preparing himself for that, running the words he owed her through his head in the dark of the main room, while the fire burned low and Evelyn slept in the sleeping room behind the door that now hung straight and level on its repaired hinges. What happened instead was quiet. She came out of the sleeping room in the early morning while he was building the fire, already dressed for travel with her hair pinned up and her expression, the composed, decided one that he had come to recognize, meant she had worked something through in the night and arrived at the other side of it. She sat at the table. He put the coffee on without being asked. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know. I'm not going to marry you." He set the coffee pot on the hook and turned. She was looking at him directly, the way she had on the porch 2 nights ago, with those gray eyes that didn't flinch from what they were looking at. "I know that too," he said. Something in her face shifted slightly. Not relief? Not quite. But the particular release of a person who has been holding a position and finds it no longer necessary. "I didn't come to this lightly. I want you to understand that. I came here in good faith, and I intended to make it work. I know you did. And you were honest with me, eventually. She paused. That matters. He sat down across from her. The tablecloth lay between them, cream-colored in the morning light, and he looked at it for a moment and thought about the afternoon in Harlow when he'd stood holding it and feeling slightly foolish. What will you do? He said. I'm not going back to Philadelphia. She said it with the flatness of someone crossing out a word. There's nothing in Philadelphia that I want to return to. I made that decision before I came here, and it stands regardless. Then what? She wrapped her hands around the coffee tin he'd set in front of her. I spoke to Tom Finch when he brought me out. He mentioned that the schoolhouse in Harlow has been without a teacher since spring. The woman before left to get married. A small, dry pause at the irony of that. I taught school for 11 years. I know how to do it. He looked at her. You'd stay in Harlow. I'd stay in Harlow. She said it as though testing the weight of it. It's not Philadelphia, but it's not nothing. There are children who need teaching and a school that needs a teacher. And that is a thing I'm genuinely good at, which is more than I could say for the life I left. He was quiet for a moment. Evelyn, don't apologize again. I was going to say that I think you'll be very good at it. She looked at him, and for the first time since her arrival, he saw something that was not composure or careful neutrality, just the plain, tired face of a woman who had come a long way and was figuring out how to stand on the ground she'd landed on. Thank you, she said. And then, after a beat, she must be something, this woman. He looked at the table. He stopped. What he wanted to say was complicated in a way that felt unfair to say to Evelyn. Yes, he said simply. Then go find her, Evelyn said. Don't sit here with me in a tablecloth letting her get further south. He looked up. I mean it, she said. I'm not a fragile woman, and I don't need to be handled gently. I came here because I wanted a life worth living, and it turns out this is not it. That is a practical conclusion, and I am a practical person, and I will get on with things. She picked up her coffee. But you are not a practical person, Gideon, whatever you've told yourself for 9 years. And that woman is riding toward Pueblo, and the longer you sit here, the harder the finding gets. He stared at her. You're telling me to go. I'm telling you what is plainly obvious from the outside. She set down the cup. When did she leave? 5 days ago? 5 days south toward Pueblo, which means she could be anywhere along that range by now. She looked at him steadily. You know this territory. I don't. But even I know that 5 days is not so many that it can't be undone. He sat with that for a moment. The strangeness of it. The particular kind of grace it required from her to say what she was saying when she had every right to say something else entirely. Why are you doing this? He said. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Because I came here wanting a life and not a arrangement, and it turns out we are in the same position in that regard, you and I, just pointed in different directions. She straightened her spine slightly, an old habit of dignity. And because I am going to live in Harlow and teach school there, and I would prefer that the nearest rancher not spend the next 9 years staring at the mountains and eating badly. The children will hear about it, and it will depress them. He almost laughed. The laugh caught in his chest. Go, she said. He went. Net. He left Evelyn at the cabin with the horse and the supplies, and an assurance that Dale Eustace's place was 2 miles east if she needed anything, and he took the trail south on his better horse, the roan, which had the endurance for a sustained run, and by mid-morning he was past Harlow and pushing hard down the range toward Pueblo. He had thought, on the way out, that he would feel something conclusive about it, the leaving, the purpose of it, the fact of riding after a woman with no certainty that she would want to be found. Instead, he felt the specific anxiety of someone acting on a truth they've admitted too late, the way you feel when you've recognized the right thing to do and are no longer certain the right thing is still available. 5 days. She'd said she was going to stop at a ranch outside Pueblo, which helped. She wasn't riding hard to a fixed destination. She was moving from work to work the way seasonal hands did, at a pace that covered ground but left room for opportunity. He knew this country in the way of someone who had ranched it for nearly a decade, knew the trading posts and the water stops, and the places where a traveler would naturally pause for a night or two. He pushed the roan hard the first day, making up the distance of her deliberate pace with his own urgency. He stopped once at a trading post on the Harlow side of the first pass, a low-built place run by a man named Cutter, who knew everyone who moved through this stretch of range. Woman alone, dark hair, canvas coat with patch repairs. Good horse, Gideon said. Might have passed through 3 or 4 days back. Cutter thought about it with the unhurried quality of a man who understood that information was currency and that spending it too fast was bad economics. Something like that came through, he said eventually. Bought grain for the horse. Didn't stay. Which way? Continued south. Said something about Arroyo Crossing. Arroyo Crossing was a settlement 2 days south, a rough collection of buildings around a river ford that served as a waypoint for people moving along this side of the mountains. He thanked Cutter and rode. The second day was harder. The trail climbed and the weather changed, the high clouds that had been decorative the morning before thickening into something with intention. And by afternoon, a cold rain was coming off the peaks sideways, the particular miserable kind that isn't heavy enough to justify stopping, but relentless enough to soak through everything by degrees. He rode with his collar up and his hat pulled low, and thought about what he was going to say when he found her, which he still had not settled to his satisfaction. He had been rehearsing things in his head since Evelyn told him to go, and they all sounded wrong. Too grand, too convenient, too much like a man who had already been offered a settled life and found it insufficient now claiming to want something harder. He understood how that looked. He understood that from Sadie's vantage point, if she'd been paying any attention to what was happening, and she had been paying attention, she paid attention to everything, his arrival would require some explaining that went beyond "I realized I had feelings." The problem with "I realized I had feelings" was that it was the kind of thing a person said when they meant I wasn't paying close enough attention to my own life, which was true but not sufficient, and he knew it. He stopped at Arroyo Crossing on the second evening, soaked and cold and aware that the roan needed rest he couldn't afford to give for too long. The settlement had a combination building, store, an eating house, and occasionally a place to sleep if the proprietor, a wide woman named Agnes, had space on her floor. Agnes had space. She also had information. Dark hair, brown eyes, traveling alone, she said, setting a bowl of something hot in front of him without asking. Yes, stayed 1 night, 2 nights back. 2 nights back. He was closing the gap. Where was she headed? Said she had work near Mesquite Creek. Agnes looked at him with the frank curiosity of someone who ran a waypoint and had seen every variety of human story come through her door. She in trouble? No, he said. I need to talk to her. Agnes looked at him the way women in frontier settlements looked at men who came in wet and urgent, claiming to simply need to talk to someone. Mesquite Creek's half a day south of here, she said. There's a sheep operation down there run by a man named Ruiz. He hires traveling cooks for the fall shearing. Thank you. Eat that first, she said, nodding at the bowl. You're not going to say anything worth hearing if you're this cold. He ate. He slept 4 hours on Agnes's floor. He was back on the roan before the light was good. The sheep operation at Mesquite Creek was a larger enterprise than he'd expected. A main house and 3 outbuildings around a central yard, everything smelling of lanolin and wood smoke, and the particular dense smell of a lot of sheep in close proximity. A young man with his father's look about him came out of the barn when Gideon rode in and watched him dismount with cautious eyes. Looking for a woman named Sadie Hartwell, Gideon said. I was told she might be working here. The young man's caution shifted into something more interesting. She left this morning, he said. Gideon felt the words land in his chest. How long ago? Before light. She finished the shearing supper last night and said she was moving on. The young man paused. She's only been here 2 days. Do you know which way? South along the creek, she said. There's a valley camp about 6 miles down used by drovers. She mentioned it. He thanked the young man and turned the roan south and pushed along the creek trail, which was narrow and overgrown in places from a summer of light use, the aspens here already past yellow and beginning to drop, the ground under them papery and bright. He had time, riding those 6 miles, to confront the question that had been following him since Harlow. What gave him the right? He had hired her. He had spoken honestly with her over 2 nights and 3 days, and let something develop in the space of those conversations that he hadn't named or addressed. And then Evelyn had arrived, and he had said nothing, and Sadie had ridden away without any indication from him that what he felt was anything beyond the ordinary gratitude of an employer. She owed him no particular welcome. She had her own direction, her own sensible geography of life, Pueblo, Santa Fe, wherever the work was. And his arriving on horseback out of the mountains was not something she'd asked for and might not want. He knew all of this, and he kept riding. The valley came into view as the creek widened, a broad open space between two ridges with the brown grass of late September flattened by the wind. He saw the campfire from the rise above it, a small orange point in the gray afternoon, and beside it a picketed horse in the low shape of a bedroll setup, and a figure crouched over the fire doing something to a pan. She didn't look up when he came down the slope. She heard the horse, the same way she'd heard his horse the first time at Miller's Crossing, and she said without turning, "Whoever you are, I'm not sharing the fire." "All right," he said. She turned then. He watched her face go through several things in quick succession. Surprise, which she controlled almost instantly, and then something less readable, a complicated compression of expression that told him she was processing more than she was showing. She stood up slowly. She looked at him on the horse, and then at the trail behind him, north, the way he'd come. "Where's your fiancée?" she said. "Harlow," he said. "She's going to teach school there." A long silence. The fire between them crackled once. The wind moved through the valley grass with a low, sustained sound. "That happened fast," she said. "It happened because it was the honest thing." He dismounted. She didn't tell him not to, which he took as the only permission he was going to get. He tied the roan to a nearby scrub and stood at the edge of the firelight. "She knew before I said anything. She's a perceptive woman." Sounds like she deserved better than the situation. "She did. She said so herself, and she was right." Sadie looked at the fire. "So you came after me?" "Yes." "Why?" He stood in the cold valley in the afternoon light with the mountains on both sides and the fire between them and looked at her, this woman he had known for 3 days and ridden 2 days in the rain to find, and said the plain version of the true thing, the way she had always said the plain version, because it was her mode of honesty and he had learned it from her. "Because the cabin was warm for the first time in 9 years when you were in it," he said, "and when you left, it wasn't." She looked at him steadily. Her expression was not soft, and it was not yielding, and it was not the thing that happened in stories when a man says the right thing to a woman. It was the expression of someone taking a careful measurement. "That's not a reason," she said. "That's a feeling." "I know the difference," he said. "I've had feelings before. I've had feelings that went away." He paused. "This one has had 5 days and several hundred miles to go away, and it hasn't gone anywhere." "You don't know me." "I know you more than I've known most people." He said it plainly, without drama. "I know you replaced a porch board without being asked because a woman in a traveling dress was going to walk over it every day. I know you put an item down from the chest and walked away without making me say a thing. I know you can look at a nearly empty larder and see a meal that isn't there yet." He looked at her. "I know you have a box like mine, and I know you keep moving so you don't have to sit still long enough for it to get heavy." The fire popped. She'd said nothing. "You said that's a long time to be alone," he said. "You said it like you knew it, like you were measuring the same distance from the inside." "Gideon," his name in her mouth, the first time she'd used it. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'll come back." "To work." "No." She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved her hair across her face, and she pushed it back with one hand and kept looking at him with those direct brown eyes that took the measure of things and called them what they were. "I'm not easy," she said. "I know that. I don't stay still naturally. I don't know if I can. I'm not asking you to be still. I'm asking you to come back to the mountain and see." "See what? Whether what we were at that table 2 nights in a row is something, or whether I'm wrong about it." She turned and looked out at the valley, south, in the direction she'd been heading, the direction of Pueblo and Santa Fe and the traveling life that was her entire life, the one she'd built out of necessity and then kept because it was safer than wanting something that could be taken away. He waited. He had said what he came to say, and the rest of it was hers. "The Ruiz boy thought I was leaving because of something his father said," she said to the valley. "I wasn't. I was leaving because I was about to stay too long and I knew it, and that scared me more than moving on." He didn't say anything. He let that sit. "I've been doing that for years," she said, "leaving before I have a reason to stay." "I know." She turned back to him. "You don't know if this is real," she said. 3 days and 2 nights. That's not long enough to know." "No," he agreed, but it's long enough to know I want to find out." A long silence. The fire burned between them, small and steady in the cold afternoon. Above the valley, the sky was going the color of old pewter, the light flattening out toward evening. She looked at the fire. She looked at the mountains north. She looked at him. "The porch rail on the right side is still loose," she said. He felt something release in his chest. "I know." "You said you'd fix it yourself." "I haven't gotten to it yet." She was quiet for another moment. Then she crouched back down and picked up the pan from the fire and said, without looking at him, "There's enough here for two if you haven't eaten." He hadn't eaten since Agnes's floor at 4 a.m. He sat down on the other side of the fire, and she handed him a tin plate, and they ate in the valley as the light went away, and the first stars appeared above the eastern ridge. And it wasn't the cabin, and it wasn't the tablecloth, and it wasn't anything resolved or certain. But it was two people on the same side of a decision, which was more than either of them had been in a long time. He looked at her across the fire. She was looking at her plate, and her face in the firelight had the quality it sometimes had, private, considering. And then she looked up and caught him looking and didn't look away. "The porch rail," she said. "First thing," he said. She looked back at her plate. But the corner of her mouth moved, and this time it stayed a moment longer before it went. They rode north together the next morning. Not early. Sadie was not a person who made large decisions and then immediately performed certainty she didn't feel, and Gideon had learned enough about her in 3 days and 2 nights and 1 valley campfire to understand that pressing for speed would be the wrong move. She broke camp at her own pace, packed her kit with the same economical precision she brought to everything, checked the horse's hooves one at a time while he waited without comment. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of Rocky Mountain morning that arrives like an argument you can't refute. All that hard blue sky and the peaks going white to gold in the early light. She mounted and looked north along the creek trail. He waited beside her. "I'm not promising anything," she said. "I know. I'm coming back to see. That's all it is right now. That's all I asked for." She looked at him once more with that measuring quality. Then she turned her horse north and rode, and he rode beside her, and they didn't talk much for the first hour, which was not uncomfortable. The way silences are uncomfortable between people who don't know each other, but the other kind. The kind that means both people are thinking and neither needs to fill the air to prove they're present. The ride back took 2 days, the same trail he'd ridden down in the rain, now dry and cold under a steady sun. They talked when there was something to say and didn't when there wasn't. And by the second morning, the rhythm of it felt natural enough that Gideon stopped monitoring it and just let it be what it was. He learned on the road things she hadn't told him over the table, that her brother in California was a carpenter named Will who wrote letters that were mostly lists of things he'd built, that she'd spent 1 winter in a town in New Mexico teaching herself to read Spanish from a dictionary and a Bible she'd traded a pair of boots for, that she'd broken her right wrist once falling from a horse in a Wyoming river crossing and set it herself with a stick and her belt because the nearest doctor was 30 miles away and she didn't have 30 miles in her. "Did it heal straight?" he asked. She held up the wrist. "Mostly," she said. "It aches in cold weather. October in the mountains is all cold weather." "I noticed that." He thought about what that meant, the ache of a badly healed thing, carried forward, becoming part of the ordinary texture of daily life. He thought about the chest at the foot of the bed and Clara's obituary folded inside it, and the ways that both of them had learned to carry what they carried, and how that was not the same as being over it, but might be enough. When they came through the gate of his property on the second afternoon and the cabin appeared through the aspens, the lime-washed walls, the straight porch, the clean window catching the light, she slowed her horse without stopping entirely and looked at it. "Still looks like someone lives there," she said. "Someone does," he said. She rode in. The first weeks were not uncomplicated. Living alongside another person after 9 years of solitude is not a graceful adjustment, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Gideon had habits that 9 years had calcified into something close to law. The specific way he stacked the firewood, the time of morning he ate, the silence he maintained until the second cup of coffee that she initially interpreted as coldness and which required explanation. She had her own architecture, built from years of moving. A reflex suspicion of permanence, a tendency to assess exits, the particular restlessness that came over her on the fourth or fifth consecutive day in one place, like an animal testing a fence line. He fixed the porch rail the morning after they arrived, which he had promised, and which she had neither forgotten nor mentioned since the valley. He did it while she was inside seeing what needed doing in the larder, and when she came out and tested it with her hand and found it solid, she looked at him for a moment without speaking. "First thing," he said. "You said that," she agreed and went back inside. It was not a declaration. It was not a tender moment in any cinematic sense. It was a man who kept a small promise to a woman who had stopped expecting people to keep small promises, and that was, in its quiet way, more significant than a grand gesture would have been. Grand gestures are easy. They require only a moment of courage. Small promises kept day after day require something more sustained and less glamorous, and both of them knew that. They were not married yet. There was a period, several weeks of it, in which they lived in the cabin as people who had agreed to find out, which was its own particular state of being. He slept in the main room. She slept in the sleeping room behind the door with the straight hinges. They ate together and worked together and had the occasional sharp exchange that comes from two strong-headed people occupying a small space, and they worked those out without catastrophe, which was its own kind of evidence. She was not easy, as she had warned. She had opinions about how things should be done that were sometimes different from his, and she stated them without softening, and he had to learn the difference between her being direct and her being unkind, because those were not the same thing even when they arrived in the same tone. He was not easy either. He had a stubbornness about certain things. The chest, the way he organized the tool wall, a general resistance to being told what he was feeling, that required her patience on days when her patience was not abundant. But they came back to the table at the end of those days. That was the thing. They came back to the table and they ate and they talked, and by the time the fire burned low, they had generally found their way back to the thing that had been real in the first place. One evening in November, about 5 weeks after she'd come back, she was sitting at the table writing a letter to her brother Will, and he was mending a harness near the fire, and she looked up from the paper and said, "I'm not going to Santa Fe." He kept working the leather. "All right. I'm not going in the spring either. I'm not going." She said it with the slight forward thrust of someone who has been circling a decision for a while and has finally committed to landing. "I wanted you to know that." He looked up. She was looking at him with the direct, undecorated quality that meant she was saying the true thing and not dressing it up. "I'm glad," he said. "I'm not promising I won't be difficult. I haven't expected easy since the day I met you." The corner of her mouth moved. She went back to her letter. He went back to the harness. Outside, the November wind had real teeth in it, and the mountains were putting on their first serious snow on the upper ridges, and the cabin held its warmth around them both. They were married in Harlow in December, at the courthouse, with Lena Marsh and Dale Eustace and his wife Marjorie as witnesses. Evelyn Whitmore attended, which was her own idea and which Sadie had been told about in advance and had said, after a moment's consideration, was fine. Evelyn stood in the back of the room in the practical wool coat she'd replaced her Eastern one with, and she looked at the proceedings with those clear gray eyes that saw more than they showed, and afterward she shook Sadie's hand with a genuine firmness and said, "He needs someone who'll tell him when he's wrong." "I've noticed that," Sadie said. "Good," Evelyn said, and went back to her school. The first winter was brutal. Not metaphorically, literally brutal, the kind of Rocky Mountain winter that tests a structure's engineering and a person's character in equal measure. 3 weeks in January where the temperature dropped so far below zero that the water in the basin froze overnight despite the fire, where the livestock required constant management just to survive, where the snow came so deep that Gideon spent entire days shoveling paths between the cabin and the barn and the well. Sadie did not go to pieces, which he had not expected her to, but he appreciated having the evidence. She was, in hard conditions, almost unnervingly steady. She rationed the lamp oil with a precision that came from knowing exactly how long a supply had to last. She figured out, in the second week of deep cold, that the root vegetables in the cellar were in danger of freezing and moved them herself without telling him until it was done. When one of the horses came up lame in late January, she stayed up 2 nights with it, not out of sentimentality, but out of the practical understanding that losing a working horse in winter was a problem they couldn't afford. The horse recovered. She was matter-of-fact about it. But there were harder nights. Nights when the wind came off the mountain with a ferocity that made the cabin walls flex, and the fire couldn't keep up with the cold coming through the floor, and they lay awake listening to the structure work against the weather. On one of those nights she was quiet, in a way that was different from her usual quiet, and he asked what she was thinking, and she said, after a while, Kansas, the sound before the grasshoppers came. He reached across in the dark and found her hand. She didn't pull away, which from Sadie was its own language. It's not coming, he said. This is just winter. I know, she said. I know that. But she held on a little longer before she let go, and he understood that knowing a thing rationally and being free of it are different conditions, and that some sounds stay in the body long after the event that made them. Spring came with the particular relief of a thing that has been earned. The snow came off the ridges in stages. The creek ran high and loud for 3 weeks. The aspens put out their new green in that tentative, luminous way that made even Gideon, who had seen 9 Rocky Mountain springs, look at them twice. Sadie planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the cabin in soil she turned herself, with seeds she'd sent Will to get from a supplier in California that she'd read about in a seed catalog she'd found at Lena's store. She was not precious about the garden. She had no illusions about what a short mountain growing season would take from it, but she worked it with the same focused attention she brought to everything, and by late summer it had produced more than either of them had anticipated. You have a gift for this, he said one evening, looking at the rose. I have a system, she said. It's not the same thing. Sometimes it is. She looked at the garden and then at the mountains beyond it and said nothing for a moment. My mother had a garden in Kansas. Before. She stopped. I always thought I didn't want one. Seemed like something to lose. He stood beside her. Does it still seem that way? She thought about it honestly, which was what she always did with honest questions. No, she said, and she sounded mildly surprised by her own answer. The letter about the tenement came in the second autumn. It arrived through a lawyer in Pittsburgh, forwarded through the postal service in Harlow, and it informed Sadie that a great-uncle she had met once as a child, a man named Arthur Hartwell, who had spent his adult life acquiring property in eastern cities with the systematic indifference of a man who understood money better than people, had died without a direct heir and left his estate divided between several distant relations, of which Sadie was one. Her portion was a tenement building in Pittsburgh containing 14 units and a leaking roof and a set of tenants who were, the lawyer's letter indicated, in various states of difficulty. She sat with the letter for 2 days before she talked to Gideon about it. He found her at the table on the second evening with the letter in front of her and the expression on her face that meant she was somewhere inside a problem she hadn't finished mapping yet. Tell me, he said. She told him. He read the letter. You could sell it, he said. I could. That would be the practical thing. She looked at the letter. The tenants have nowhere else to go. The letter says 3 of the families have been there over 10 years. There are children. She paused. If I sell it to the kind of person who wants to buy a tenement building in Pittsburgh, those families are out by spring. He looked at her. What do you want to do? I don't know yet. She picked up the letter. I know that selling it for what it's worth feels wrong, and I know that keeping it means dealing with a building I've never seen in a city I've never been to, with a roof that needs fixing, and tenants who need a landlord who actually pays attention. Then go look at it, he said. She looked up. You'd be all right here? It's autumn. The hard work is done for the season. He met her eyes. Go look at it. See what's actually there before you decide. She went to Pittsburgh in October, which required the kind of logistical effort that reminded both of them how far they lived from everything. She was gone 3 weeks. Gideon kept the ranch and fed the garden's last harvest into the root cellar and wrote her 2 letters that she later told him were the most practically informative love letters she had ever received, containing as they did detailed updates on the horse's hoof, the condition of the south fence, and a single sentence at the end of the second one that said, The cabin is cold in a way it hasn't been since before I hired a cook. Come home when you're ready. She came home with a plan. The tenement, she told him, was in better structural shape than the lawyer's letter suggested. The roof leaked in 2 places that were fixable, not catastrophic. The 14 units held 23 adults and 11 children, most of them working people who paid their rent when they had it and fell behind when they didn't. The previous management had been an indifferent collection agency that took money and returned nothing. I talked to the families, she said, sitting at the table across from him, the familiar lamp between them. All of them. I spent a week just talking. What did you find out? That they're not tenants in the way that word usually means. They're people who built a life in those rooms and have nowhere else to build one. The woman in the first floor unit has been there 12 years. She knows every child in the building by name. Sadie stopped. I know what that is. I've been the person with nowhere else to build. He was quiet. I want to make it a cooperative, she said. The families pay into a shared account, less than they pay now. And that account covers the maintenance and the taxes and the repairs. They have a voice in decisions. Nobody can be put out without cause and a hearing. She looked at him steadily. I've been reading about it. There are models for it. It's not a new idea. It's not a profitable one either, he said. No. She held his gaze. But it's the right one. He sat with that. He thought about the things she'd said over the months they'd been together. About the grasshopper year. About the men who couldn't come back from losing what they'd built. About the particular damage of being the person with nowhere else to go. He thought about a chest at the foot of a bed with a broken watch and $40 and a folded piece of newsprint, and what it meant to keep the things you couldn't put down even when they hurt. All right, he said. It won't make money. I know. It might cost money, some years. I know that too. She looked at him in the lamplight with that expression she sometimes had, the one where she was taking a careful measurement, and then she nodded once and said, I'll write to the lawyer tomorrow. The cooperative took 2 years to establish properly, requiring more letters and more lawyers than either of them had patience for, and one trip back to Pittsburgh by Sadie in the second year to deal with a tax complication in person. But it held. The families stayed. The roof got fixed. The woman on the first floor, whose name was Mrs. Cora Billings, wrote Sadie a letter in the third year of the cooperative's existence that was 1 page long and said, in its entirety, I have lived in this building 20 years, and for the first time, I am not afraid. Thank you for seeing us. Sadie kept that letter in the wooden chest. Not with the recipe paper from the first morning, which had been promoted to the kitchen shelf years ago and was stained now with use, the ink slightly faded but still legible. The letter from Mrs. Billings went in the chest, beside the broken watch and Clara's obituary, which Gideon had finally taken out one evening and shown her without being asked. She had read it carefully. She had held it for a moment. She looks like someone who laughed easily, Sadie said, which was not what he expected. She did, he said. Almost about anything. Sadie refolded it along the original creases and handed it back. She'd have liked this mountain, she said. He thought about that for a long time afterward. Their daughter Rose arrived in the 4th year, in February, which was the wrong month for it, but babies in the mountains have their own calendars. The birth was hard. A long labor in a cold room with Marjorie Eustace in attendance because the doctor from Harlow didn't make it through the snow in time, and Sadie did what Sadie did in hard conditions, which was go still and focused and get through it without drama. And then afterward, lie with the baby on her chest and look at her with an expression that Gideon had not seen on her before and could not have described accurately except to say that it was the most unguarded he had ever seen her. Rose, Sadie said. You sure? He said. I'm sure. She looked at the baby. After the wild roses on the south fence in June. I decided in June. He had not known she'd been deciding in June. He sat beside her on the rope bed, the bed with its new straw fill, the bed they had relashed together on a Sunday in the first spring when it finally needed it, and looked at the two of them and felt something so far past what he had language for that he stopped trying to name it. You did well, he said. Sadie looked at him over the baby's head with those direct brown eyes. We both know I did the work here. That's true. Don't forget it. He laughed and she laughed, and the baby startled at the sound and then settled, and Marjorie Eustace in the doorway shook her head and went to make the coffee. Years have a way of becoming each other, not seamlessly. Life is not seamless, and theirs was not the exception. There were bad winters and a drought in the 5th year that nearly took the south pasture. There were the ordinary damages of living close to another person for a long time. The arguments that went on longer than they should, the silences that were the wrong kind, the nights when one of them needed something the other didn't have enough of to give. There was a summer when Sadie's restlessness came back with a force she couldn't argue down, and she was difficult in a way that was hard to live beside, and she knew it and couldn't entirely stop it, and Gideon endured it without pretending it wasn't happening, which was the only response that had any chance of working. He had gotten better over the years at not trying to fix what wasn't a problem to be solved, and she had gotten better, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that the work on actual things is always slow and imperfect, at staying when staying scared her. Rose grew up running between the garden and the barn and the creek with the unself-conscious freedom of a child who has never known what it is to have too little space, which was its own kind of gift. She had Gideon's stubbornness and Sadie's directness and something that was neither of them, a laughing quality, an ease with strangers, an ability to walk into any room and find the person who most needed talking to. She went to Evelyn's school in Harlow when she was old enough, and Evelyn taught her to read and do sums and think in complete sentences. And when Rose was 9, she wrote Evelyn a composition about her family that Evelyn sent home with a note that said, "This child writes like someone who has been listening carefully her whole life." Sadie put that note in the chest too. The chest had become something other than what it started as. It was still the same chest, same pine, same iron hardware, sitting in the same corner of the sleeping room, but it held different things now, or the same things differently. Clara's obituary was still in it, and always would be, because some things you carry not as wounds, but as the evidence of a life that was real. The broken watch was there. The $40 in silver had long since been spent on practical things. But there was the recipe for apricot cornmeal, now copied out properly in Sadie's handwriting on a clean piece of paper. There was Mrs. Billings' letter. There was Rose's school composition. There was, at the very bottom, a short note in Evelyn's controlled hand that simply said, "The porch rail is still solid. E.W." A private joke that had started when Evelyn had come to supper in the second year and tested the rail with both hands and announced her findings, and which had become a kind of ongoing report between the two women on the general state of things. The chest was not a box of pain anymore, though it had been that once. It was the record of a life, not arranged, not curated, just accumulated with the honest randomness of things that mattered enough to keep. Gideon understood that now in a way he hadn't, when he'd refused to let Sadie move it. Some things you keep because letting go would be a lie, and some things you add because being alive means accumulating evidence that it was worth showing up for. He had been a man who kept the box and called it surviving. She had been a woman who kept moving and called it being practical. What they had done over the years was teach each other a third thing, not surviving alone and not running from the possibility of loss, but the harder middle way, staying with what was real, even when real was difficult, even when it ached in cold weather like a wrist that healed mostly straight. He fixed things when they broke. She grew what she could from the short seasons. They came back to the table at the end of the hard days and sat across the tablecloth, replaced twice now, always with the same plain cream-colored cotton, and said what needed saying and left alone what didn't. It was not a perfect life. It was not the life either of them had planned or imagined or written to each other about, in careful letters designed to present a reasonable version of themselves. It was the actual one, built out of a cracked window and 3 days of cleaning and 2 nights of honest conversation and a woman who rode south and a man who followed. It was built out of a porch board replaced without being asked, and a cup left on a table overnight, and the plain admission that a cabin is just logs and mud if no one in it has decided to stay. One evening in October, the 11th or 12th October, neither of them kept precise count anymore. Gideon was sitting on the repaired porch in the cold, which was a thing he still did, and Sadie came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him, and they looked at the mountains going dark the way the mountains always went dark, indifferent and enormous and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they don't need you to think so. Rose was inside doing her schoolwork, the lamp throwing her shadow on the clean window. The aspens along the creek had gone gold again, the way they did every year, that annual brief extravagance before the cold took them. "What are you thinking?" she said. He looked at the mountains. He thought about the January morning, many years back, when he had stood in the doorway of a dirty cabin and said hell to no one, and the particular quality of that loneliness, the kind that isn't dramatic, isn't a wound, Just the slow, steady weight of days that pass without leaving a mark on anything. He thought about riding to Miller's Crossing and finding a woman crouched over a fire who said, "I'm not buying anything," without turning around, and how that was the first true thing anyone had said to him in longer than he could account for. "Nothing specific," he said. She looked at the mountains too. The last light was leaving the highest peaks, that familiar sequence, and the cold was getting serious. "Good nothing or bad nothing," she said. He looked at her beside him on the porch. The canvas coat she still wore, different canvas now, but the same essential coat. The hat pushed back the same way. Her face in the mountain twilight, carrying its years the way a face does when it's lived in honestly. "Good nothing," he said. She drank her coffee. He drank his. Inside, Rose's shadow moved across the lit window, bent over her books, learning the words for the world. The aspens moved. The mountains held their dark and enormous patience. And they sat in the cold together, close enough that their arms touched, neither of them needing to say anything else about any of it.